Our second conceptualization of the modern global economy is that there is a three-tier structure, which I already hinted at in the previous video when I looked at the table of Funk and I looked at low income, middle income, and high income groupings. And so what we have essentially is we have a core, or a group of core countries, or super wealthy countries. We have a group of super poor countries, or peripheral countries. Then we have these countries that are in between. So this also overlaps very nicely with the demographic transition model, which we see here. So this is the demographic transition model, which also relates to economics, so we could call it the economic transition model. And so the moral of the story is stage 2 countries, demographically, continue on as far as their characteristics economically. And so we see some patterns and some trends continue to build and build over previous concepts. So further, we can go ahead and identify different groups. So we have our first group. We refer to these as lower income countries or peripheral countries. Then we have the second group, these stage 3, early stage 4 countries. We'll call them newly industrializing. We'll also refer to them as middle income countries. And finally, we've got our stage 4 countries, our advanced economies, our developed countries, in which we have characteristics there. So let's focus more in on these early peripheral or developing countries in terms of economic characteristics. And so what's going on are these are places that are going to have lower levels of education. Subsequently, because they have lower skill sets, they're going to demand lower salaries and thus have less technology. And so once again, we're going to see the digital divide play out here. And so in terms of demographic transition model stage, because there really are no countries that are stage 1, these are going to be a lot of our stage 2 and early stage 3 countries. But with that being said, these countries that are lower income, peripheral, developing, heavily agriculturally based, which is why they're pre-industrial, because industrialization or manufacturing or making stuff hasn't kicked in, they have a lot of room for growth. And so at times, these countries here, that are these stage 2, stage 3 countries, are actually the ones that are primed to have the fastest growth going forward, because they essentially have nothing much. Where do we find a lot of these countries? We find them in the Caribbean, throughout much of Africa, parts of South Central Asia, South America, Oceania. All of these are places in which you see a large presence of these peripheral countries. In between the peripheral low-income countries and our core high-income countries, we have this transition area. And so these are going to be these middle-income countries. We're also going to refer to these as the semi-periphery, because they're kind of in the middle, but also newly industrializing countries is how I'm going to call them more often than not. In economic circles, they're also referred to as emerging markets. So what's happening here is industrialization is occurring. They're now manufacturing and making stuff. And so subsequently, because of that, more and more people are moving to urban areas for jobs. So it relates to, once again, migration. But these are also places in which you're seeing transitions from stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4. Where do we see this? East Asia, in particular, of course, China, Southeast Asia, for example, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam. They're manufacturing more stuff there. India is emerging as an industrial manufacturer here going forward in the next 10 to 20 years. Brazil, for sure. Kind of, sort of Russia, but also South Africa. On the continent of Africa, there is industrialization occurring, but not much. And so if you go back to assignment 2, where your stuff comes from, you saw that manufacturing-wise, not a lot of stuff that was made in Africa. The exception maybe would be South Africa. But more and more often you're going to see, going forward, countries in Africa start to industrialize. Countries in those previous peripheral countries start to transition, and they're going to start manufacturing stuff. And all of this is kind of the quest for cheap labor, which I'll explain later on throughout this chapter. Finally, we have our core, our developed countries that have the highest levels of education, the highest salaries, the highest skill sets, highest levels of technology, are on the good side of the digital divide, and essentially are places that generate wealth. They create the global economy, and they run the global economy. So these are those stage 4 countries. We're also going to refer to them as post-industrial. We'll see this going forward in future discussions in this chapter regarding the increase of service sector jobs, or non-manufacturing and non-agricultural and mining types of jobs. And so that's what I mean by post-industrial. High-income countries, core, also I'll refer to these as advanced economies. Where do we find these? East Asia, for example, parts of China, Japan, you could throw in maybe South Korea, Western Europe, and a little bit of Eastern Europe, Australia, New Zealand, of course, Northern America, in particular Canada and the United States, are all stage 4 demographic countries, but also economically are core high-income developed countries. Characteristic happening right now is a lot of these stage 4 countries, because they're so big economically, it's hard to make them grow and have a significant impact on that growth, is they're very much economically becoming more stagnant. So it also relates to demographics. So we saw demographic-wise kind of stagnant, slow growth, if anything at all. We also see economically slow economic growth, and in many respects, in some places, economic decline.